So I'm going to introduce Jay McClellan now, who is going to moderate our afternoon scientific session. And Jay, as you know, is a professor of psychology here at Stanford. And Jay, I've always admired him because even though he sort of came up in the neural networks side of the trade, very sort of theory and simulation oriented, Jay has collaborated regularly with experimentalists over his career. I'm even pleased to say that I have one paper collaborating with Jay. That was really nice. So Jay's obviously one of the historical figures in this field. This whole topic of artificial and natural intelligence has been his life, really. And so Jay, welcome to the podium.
So thank you, Bill. It's a tremendous pleasure and honor for me to be able to chair this afternoon's session. I just want to set the context of this by saying that when I was being recruited to Stanford, I went and visited with one of the professors in the computer science department, and we were talking about neural networks, and she nodded very politely, and she said, yes, you know, we've stopped teaching about that in our core courses in computer science. At that time, probabilistic Bayesian models were taking over the world, and they have, of course, a major role to play in our understanding of computation and cognition. But I was very pleased with the revolution that ensued shortly after this little meeting. And all three of the speakers in this afternoon's session are hugely important in that, and that's the specific reason why I think it's such a great honor for me to be standing here and saying this to you. I'm not going to go through all the details of that, but I'll say a little tiny bit more about each one along the way. The first of our speakers this afternoon is Matt Botvinick. Matt was an undergraduate here at Stanford in art history, was it? Then he went to medical school, and then he became a cognitive neuroscientist. He joined the PhD program at Carnegie Mellon, where I was on the faculty at that time, and went on from there to work with David Plaut and Jonathan Cohen and others to do some really important, interesting work on cognitive control and the role of context in behavior and sequential action, and then became very interested in reinforcement learning and started writing some really exciting papers about that that I only started reading recently, but he's been writing for over 10 years now. So at the edge of that sort of winter, he was like really latching into these new ideas that I'm sure he's going to be telling us a lot about today. So please welcome Matt Botvinick.
Test. Yeah, perfect. Okay, great. Thanks, Jay. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to join this great symposium. All of the talks have been completely fascinating. And I don't think I've ever felt quite so well set up for a talk, because almost everything I want to say in my introduction has already been said. So I might make it through this talk without racing through my last 20 slides at the end. So yes, I want to talk about reinforcement learning and about deep learning, but I want to start with some larger context. So Jay just mentioned this revolution that we're in the middle of in the AI world, and I think when somebody sits down to write the history of this revolution, it would be reasonable, and they probably will start with this paper in 2012, which was sort of a shot heard around the world. Let me just make sure. I'm going to use the pointer here so every screen can see. Which was out of Jeff Hinton's lab. Many of you will know this paper. It used convolutional neural networks with backpropagation to do surprisingly well on this image classification task, ImageNet, that somebody already mentioned. Feifei was involved in getting out there. And a huge amount has followed from this. I find it interesting sometimes to track these citations on Google Scholar, and you can see this paper was published in 2012, has already been, probably if you checked it again, it'd be up to 30,000 by now. There really is just a frenzy of activity going on in this space. And incredible advances, it seems, almost every day. They're not all using convolutional neural networks. Some equally impressive engineering feats have been accomplished with recurrent neural networks. I'm just going to say a little bit about these because we'll come back to them later in my talk. But for those of you who aren't familiar with artificial neural networks, we can diagram a feed-forward neural network in this way and then contrast that with a recurrent neural network where there are loops in the connectivity. And the important thing about that is then you can have memory in your system because activity in these artificial neurons can go from one time step to another and keep information around. And you can simplify this kind of diagram by just drawing a circular arrow. And then you can unfold this little recurrent neural network in time. I just want to introduce this kind of graphical convention for later. So this is the internal layer of a network like this on time step 1, and then these are the connections between the neurons and themselves on the next time step and so forth. And if you unfold a neural network like this gives me an opportunity to explain how a sequence-to-sequence network operates, where you feed in inputs step by step, and then later in the sequence, you may continue to feed in inputs, but you ask the network to output a sequence. And so if you imagine that these are English words and say these are, I don't know, French words, or vice versa, you can understand how a network like this could be used for translation. And in fact, this is exactly how Google Translate works. So this is another example of where neural network technology was applied to an interesting task really at scale. And this was part of the revolution that led especially engineers to realize that neural networks might actually be useful for real-world tasks. And then, I could probably spend an hour, showcasing all of the amazing mixing and matchings of these kinds of technologies, for example, combining language processing with image processing and so forth. So a couple of things to say about the sorts of advances that I've mentioned. First is that, and a couple of people have touched on this, actually, a surprising amount of what's going on right now, we already knew. We already had these insights. We already had most of these techniques, honestly, when I was in high school. And what's happened recently is really, a lot of it is engineering advances. We found ways, I'm using the royal we here, we found ways of making these techniques that we've known about for quite a while scale. We found ways of allowing them to scale up to very large, rich data sets. And that's why they've circled back into the limelight in engineering and out of the winter's cold that Jay referred to. And I just want to mention as an aside, at DeepMind, I think the mean age is something like 27 or something, and most people have, even though they're the world's experts on these techniques, they don't know this history, which is sort of a thorn in my side. So it's nice to come back to a neuroscience context where people have a little bit of a longer integration constant and know about this stuff. However, of course, the resurgence of interest in neural networks, now sort of rebranded as deep learning, has led to a resurgence of interest in neuroscience as well, which I think is good for everyone. And Jim talked about his amazing work in this area with Dan Yeomans, which is sort of emblematic of how far you can get by taking these deep learning systems and comparing what they learn to what you see in the nervous system. And I can make the same case for recurrent neural networks, for example, training recurrent neural networks on cognitive tasks and then comparing what's going on inside with what you see, for example, in the prefrontal cortex and making interesting connections and gaining insight that way. So all of that is great, and I'm all for it, and that's why I'm working at DeepMind and trying to link the goings-on there with neuroscience. However, in my view, as much as we tend to associate this idea of a revolution in AI with deep learning, my personal view is there's actually a more important revolution that's been going on that's less familiar to neuroscientists. And this has actually already come up. So Doina's talk was largely about this, and it goes under the heading of not deep learning, but deep reinforcement learning. So the idea here is you use these deep neural networks, same kinds of deep neural networks that we've been talking about all along, but instead of training them in a supervised fashion where you give them the answer you want for any input, instead you just give the system a reward of some magnitude or even a punishment. And you let it figure out on its own what the best behavior is in order to maximize reward in that setting. So the breakthrough paper here, arguably, was one that came out of my company, DeepMind. This was before I arrived there, which used deep convolutional neural networks and reinforcement learning attain superhuman performance on this classic suite of Atari games. And then this was followed up, of course, as has already been mentioned, with this amazing, really epic-making work on Go, with the really fascinating papers that have followed from that by colleagues of mine at DeepMind. By the way, if you haven't heard about it, there's a great documentary about AlphaGo. I wish I had more information on this slide, but you can look it up on Netflix. It wasn't produced by DeepMind. It's not like an advertising pitch. It was made by an independent director, and it's really quite good. So deep reinforcement learning has really become a mature field in itself now. And just to give you another example of what can be done, here's some recent work from DeepMind on capture the flag. What you're seeing on the left here is what the agent actually sees. So it gets pixel level input of a maze, a randomly configured maze, where it has to play capture the flag against competitors who are also RL agents who are learning on their own. And these agents get to superhuman levels of ability just through reinforcement learning. So the only signal they're getting is, did you win or not? And then from there, they have to figure out strategies and behaviors. So now, you could make a case that this isn't new either. People have been trying to get neural networks and reinforcement learning to play together nicely for many years. And in fact, there's a famous paper from the 90s that succeeded in using what is now called deep reinforcement learning to play backgammon. But really, this is essentially the only paper that's out there. In contrast to supervised learning in deep neural networks, where there was a whole field of study, nobody had really figured out how to get deep learning and reinforcement learning to work together robustly. And that's the real revolution that's going on. So I think that this is revolutionary not only from the point of view of AI, because it gives us the opportunity to train systems to do things that we really have no idea how to do, like play Go at superhuman levels. But I think it's also of revolutionary import for neuroscience. And it's easy to make this case. We know, as well as we know anything about the brain, that it learns in part through reinforcement learning. Our current understanding of how the dopamine system works is based very directly on at the same algorithms that we're using to train AlphaGo. There's a direct mathematical connection there. And so maybe we can learn more about how the brain is doing reinforcement learning by studying what happens in these deep RL systems. But at a higher level, maybe more a cognitive level, what really fascinates me about deep reinforcement learning as a neuroscientist as well as an AI researcher is that it's really about two things. One is representation learning, right? So neural networks are about representation learning. We've seen many compelling examples of how the internal representations of these networks develop into interesting forms in order to support complex behavior, even in the small number of talks we've heard today. But it joins representation learning with goal-directed behavior. So the representations are really there to support rational behavior that maximizes reward at the far end. And that seems like it covers an awful lot of what we're interested in as neuroscientists. So that's my pitch for the relevance of deep RL for neuroscience. However, it's worth asking whether the kinds of deep RL systems that we're building are really plausible models for understanding how animals, including humans, actually learn, including the way that they learn through reinforcement learning. And some skepticism has been expressed. And that's what I want to talk about with the rest of my time. So there's this very beautiful paper by Brendan Lake and colleagues. Brendan, I just found out, was an undergrad here. Is now at NYU. And he pointed out a problem, as he saw it, with DeepMind's Atari work, which is that although these networks learn to play a mean game of Atari, it takes them a long time. Meaning they have to play many, many, many games before they get to a respectable level of performance. And in machine learning and elsewhere, there's a term for this, which is sample efficiency. They're very sample inefficient algorithms. It takes a large sample of data in order to get to that superhuman level. And Brendan illustrated this by contrasting a learning curve from DQN, the model that appeared in that Nature paper from DeepMind, against a human data point, which is his own play on this game Frostbite. And you can see Brendan gets to a pretty respectable level after really only a few minutes of play on this game, whereas DQN is still basically flatlining for many, many millions of frames after that. So seems a little glib perhaps, but the point is quite valid and important, and it's one that, that we're very interested in at DeepMind, and we had already been discussing a lot even before Brendan made this point so beautifully in this paper. So why is deep reinforcement learning so sample inefficient? There are at least two very important reasons. And one is the need for incremental parameter optimization. So these neural networks, whether they're feed-forward or recurrent, have huge numbers of parameters, where the parameters include all of the little synaptic weights that make up these models, which can be in the millions or higher in number. And so in order to find a good set of connection weights, it takes a lot of data, because you have to move slowly as you traverse these landscapes that Surya was talking about, slowly searching for that global minimum. And you also have to make sure that you're repeating data over and over again, at least approximately, because there's a problem in deep neural networks where the system will tend to forget what it learned earlier if you don't keep rehearsing it on that same material or material of the same kind. So incremental parameter updates are part of the problem. There's another problem, though, which is weak inductive bias. What do I mean by that? So in machine learning, there is a very important distinction that you'll learn in like an undergraduate class between bias and variance. A model that has high variance can fit almost any data set that you throw at it. So if I wanted to fit these data points here, find a function that fits those, a high variance fit would go perfectly through all those points, and it wouldn't really care how wiggly the function was. It would take a lot more data in order for a high variance model to figure out that this really should be a second order polynomial. You'd have to get a lot more little red x's in there before it was forced to that conclusion, because it has the flexibility to model many different functions. If you have a model that's already constrained, a model that already has an initial bias toward particular kinds of function, toward particular kinds of hypotheses about what the data really means, then the system will converge on the right answer much more quickly, and that's referred to in machine learning as bias, as many of you will know. Bias sounds like a bad thing, but it can be a good thing if the system is endowed with biases that actually fit with the structure of the data that it needs to learn about. Things can go too far. You can have too strong a bias that keeps you from seeing the patterns you're looking for. But having a bit of the right kind of inductive bias is a big win if you want sample-efficient learning. So deep neural networks like the Atari model that I mentioned earlier don't have very strong inductive biases. This is nice because you can throw them at a bunch of different problems and they'll eventually learn to solve a very wide range of problems. But because they don't have that initial bias, they need a lot of data before they're sort of forced to finding the right general answer in any domain. So those are the sources, at least two sources of sample inefficiency. And what I want to talk about is ways that we can get around those aspects of deep reinforcement learning so that we can end up with deep reinforcement learning systems that actually are fast, that actually don't need huge amounts of data in order to arrive at interesting patterns of behavior and generalization. And I'm going to talk about three strategies that we're very interested in at DeepMind and have also been studied by other groups. All of these also, as I'll get to, have very important neuroscientific correlates or implications. So the three strategies I want to talk about are episodic control, meta-learning, and architectural bias. So let's start with episodic control, and I'll explain the idea through a particular example. And this is, I've done some work on episodic control, but this particular model that I'm going to talk about was not from I wasn't on this paper. It's by a colleague of mine at DeepMind, Alex Pritzel, and another group of researchers last year. So what's going on in this model? This is sort of a schematic of a deep neural network, but it's not the kind of deep neural network that you've been hearing about in earlier talks or so far in mine. What happens in this neural network is the system gets some pixel input, so picture like an Atari screen, and that goes through a couple of sets of layers of convolutional neural network. And then that turns out through standard deep neural network connections, it outputs a vector of activations. So you can picture a set of units here, each of which has an activity level. This activity pattern, this vector, which we sometimes refer to just as an embedding of the input image, is stored in an array. So this is a little bit like a computer memory bank, slot-based memory we often call it. And every time the system takes in a new image, it forms one of these embedding vectors and throws it into its memory. As the system gains more experience and finds out how well things went after it confronted that image, it'll tack on to that embedding a Q value, which is a representation of how well things went after that image was encountered, conditioned on the assumption that the agent made a particular action. So if I saw that image, I did this, I pulled the joystick forward, and then after that, here's a number that indicates how well things went. All right, and then at the output end, what we want is a system that uses that memory bank to see a new image and to tell us how good it would be, how good it can be predicted to be to pull the joystick in that same direction. And the way that that's accomplished is through a comparison between what I'm seeing now and what I have stored in memory. So the system takes in a new Atari frame, forms an embedding, and then compares that embedding against all the embeddings it's stored in its memory bank through a simple like cosine distance or a similar distance metric. And then it takes a weighted average across those embeddings, where the weightings are the similarity measures, averages across the values that were associated with the relevant embeddings, and spits out a value. So just in case you didn't follow all of the details there, what's going on is the system is just throwing vectors into memory and then comparing each new vector, every vector that represents a new experience, with everything that's stored in its memory. And notice that this can be done immediately. The system can immediately, the minute it's had an experience, it can leverage that in order to guide later behavior. So this is a way of getting around incremental parameter adjustments. This does not require very slow adjustments of millions of connection weights. It just requires the system to throw this vector into its memory, and then it can immediately do this comparison operation. And this pays off in terms of sample efficiency. So this is a plot showing over millions of frames on Atari how well the agent is doing. And this neural episodic control system is plotted here in blue. And, oops, sorry, too many advances. This green trace here corresponds to one of the better DQN versions that Brendan denigrated in his paper. So you can see it's learning a lot faster. Okay, so that's one way that we can use new techniques in deep RL in order to learn faster and get around the incremental parameter adjustment problem. Now, I want to make one point that I'm going to come back to repeatedly, which is that we have a case here where we see fast reinforcement learning, fast deep reinforcement learning, but it's dependent, and I've kind of swept this under the rug so far, it's dependent on slow learning, because the format of this embedding vector, the way that the system represents the current frame, is a function of all the connection weights in these convolutional neural networks. So the thing can kind of work if those are just random. It doesn't work. It's not as if you need a very precise, perfect set of connection weights here in order to get an embedding that just kind of gets you off the ground. But naturally, some representations on this end are better than others. If you want to compare what's going on now to something in memory and draw conclusions from that, it matters a lot how you represent what's going on now, and it matters a lot how things are represented in memory. And the way that this system learns to represent what's going on now is by incremental parameter updates. So this is a first example, and we'll see several, of fast learning in a deep RL setting, depending on a different form of learning, which is slow. And I'll come back to this theme. Okay, but let's move on now to a second strategy for getting sample-efficient learning in deep RL, and this is meta-learning, otherwise known as learning to learn. And I'll illustrate the idea through a psychology experiment. The term learning to learn was actually introduced originally in psychology in the 40s, and this was the experiment that introduced the term. And I still think it's a great way of illustrating what this all means. So this was an experiment done by Harry Harlow, and it was a monkey experiment. He also did this experiment with human children. So he presented the monkey with two objects that the monkey had never seen. And the monkey was allowed to pick up an object, and it got to see whether there was a reward, a raisin, under that object. There might be a raisin, there might not. After that, the same two objects were placed in front of the monkey again. They could be in the same positions or they could be reversed, and the monkey was allowed to choose one again. And this went on for 6 rounds. And then, crucially, 2 completely new objects were introduced, objects that the monkey, again, was presumed never to have seen before, and the whole procedure started again. And everything went in blocks of 6 trials, and the monkey was presented with hundreds of pairs of objects. What the monkey didn't know at first, but figured out, was that there was a consistent rule across all of the objects, which is simply that for any two objects, one of them was good, there was always a raisin under it, and one was bad, there was never a raisin under it, and it didn't matter what position they were in. So what Harlow observed and reported was that the monkey's behavior got better and better over the course of learning, over the course of many blocks of trials with different objects. But what was really of interest was its final performance profile after hundreds of rounds, which looked like what's shown in pink here. On the first trial with a pair of new objects, the monkey was at chance. It had to be. These were objects it had never seen before. How could it know what the good object was? But critically, on the second trial, the monkey was at ceiling. The monkey always picked the good object, even if it hadn't picked that object on the first trial. And this reflects knowledge of the structure of the task. This reflects knowledge that one object's going to be bad, one object's going to be good. So if I choose one object and it's bad, I immediately know the other object's good, regardless of what position it shows up in the next trial. So you can think of this as an inductive bias. The animal understands the structure of the task and uses that knowledge to draw inferences. And that's exactly what inductive bias means. So how can we get that sort of thing in a neural network? This is the sort of thing that Bayesian models were, Jay mentioned their ascendancy up until recently in cognitive science and AI, and this was exactly the kind of thing that seemed like you needed to resort to those kinds of techniques to get, because neural networks were never going to have these inductive biases. They're low bias systems. But it turns out you can get this sort of bias if you set things up the right way. So let's return to this recurrent neural network, kind of unrolled in time using the convention that I introduced earlier. And instead of labeling it to explain translation, let's label it to address reinforcement learning. So now we're looking at a system that's trained using reinforcement learning to output actions. And on the input side, it's getting observations, like think Atari screens. Also, critically, it's getting auxiliary inputs that are telling it, reminding it essentially what action it selected on the previous time step and what reward it got for that action on the previous time step. So you can think of these external inputs really, if this were a brain, these would be like corollary discharge. This would be feedback telling you, this is the action that you just executed. And by the way, this is the reward that you just got. So if you set a neural network up like this, and you train it not on a single task, but a set of tasks that all have some underlying shared structure, meta-learning just happens. And the reason that it happens is you're training the neural network by adjusting the connection weights in the system, but what the system learns to do is to use its activity-based memory to implement a reinforcement learning algorithm. So up until now, we've been talking about reinforcement learning operating through the connection weights. Reinforcement learning changes the connection weights in the system. Here we're talking about a situation where it's actually the activity-based memory in the system that's accomplishing reinforcement learning. Think of it this way. You have an action output here, which can be based on previous actions and rewards. So that the system keeps information around in its internal activity patterns about what actions and what rewards happened in the past, and then it can use that information to select good actions now. This is reinforcement learning. But it's being implemented at the level of the activity patterns in the network and how they evolve, not in changes to the synaptic weights. This is what we refer to as meta-reinforcement learning, and just in case the current patter is not getting you the intuition, I can point you to a paper, and I'll come back to it in a minute, that tries to lay it out in an intuitive fashion. But let me show you the result. So we can take this Harlow task, and we can turn it into a format that one of our deep RL agents can deal with. We make it a visual selection task, a visual saccade task. So we have videos that are fed into our system in pixel form. The agent has to look left or right in order to select one of these image patches. and that it's either given a reward for looking at that patch or it's not given a reward. And other than that, the task is exactly like the Harlow task. Every 6 trials, we introduce new images that the system has never seen before. And we want to see whether it develops this inductive bias. Can the system, even though it's a deep neural network, can it do that kind of one-shot learning, which we see the animals do? And the answer is that it can. After sufficient practice with this task, the system can be given 2 new images, and after one action and one outcome, can immediately choose the right image after that, reflecting this kind of inductive bias. So again, this is happening at the level of the activity-based memory. So for those of you who are familiar with the neuroscience literature on working memory, which is, many of us believe, based on sustained activity rather than synaptic changes, that's the level at which this system is solving the reinforcement learning problem. And it's for that reason that the system gets around this incremental parameter change problem, because it's not changing its millions of parameters, where the parameters are the connection weights of the system. It's just changing the activities of its units. And that has a totally different character. Now let's come back, though, before we move on to the next example, to this fast versus slow point, because the point is even more, I think, trenchant here. So I've been talking about how a system of this kind can learn to do fast reinforcement learning. You just saw an example. Sees a new pair of images and immediately figures out what to do. That's fast reinforcement learning. But here we have, again, a case where fast reinforcement learning grows out of slow reinforcement learning. It's the reinforcement learning algorithm that's training up this system really is working by slowly adjusting the connection weights in the system. Of course, the effect of that is to change the activity dynamics so that the activity dynamics can learn very quickly in new situations. But there really is still this kind of bedrock of learning which is slow and also very low bias. So the system doesn't know anything about the Harlow rules when it goes into this, and it's the low bias of this slow learning mechanism that allows it to tune into that set of rules rather than some other arbitrary set of rules. And it's that slow learning that provides the foundation for fast learning. So again, another example of how deep reinforcement learning can go fast and can get around these problems of incremental parameter adjustment and low bias. But it turns out that success there depends still on slow learning. Okay, so here's the third case study that I want to present, which is about architectural bias. So in fact, we've been talking about a classical case of architectural bias all along every time somebody mentions convolutional neural networks. So usually when people introduce convolutional neural nets to a neuroscience audience or any other audience, what they say is, oh, a convolutional neural network has local feature detectors. So each unit here is listening to a set of units in the previous layer and computing some function, acting as some sort of filter on activities in some local patch of the image or in a subsequent layer processing the image. And that's a valid description. But what often isn't said out loud is that, in fact, the reason we call these convolutional neural networks is that there's a strong constraint on the weight matrix, which says that if I decide, or if backpropagation decides to build a certain feature detector here, it will also automatically build that same feature detector here, 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 here. This is called weight tying. So when the system learns a face detector over in this part of visual space, it will automatically build that same face detector over here and 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 over here throughout the entire visual field. So there's this principle of reuse in convolutional neural networks, and that is an inductive bias because it builds in the assumption that the images, the data that the system is going to be dealing with, involves some sort of translational invariance property, where if it's useful to have a feature detector of some kind over here, it's also useful to have it over there. If I see a face over there and that's a useful thing to do, to detect, then it's probably also going to be useful for me to detect a face over there. So there's an inductive bias here that's built into the architecture. This is why we call it an architectural bias. So this is just one case, a hugely important case of architectural bias. There are others. So in fact, you can think about hierarchical reinforcement learning, the topic that Doina covered, as involving a particular kind of inductive bias, which is again about reuse. Because when you have subroutines or options, The idea is you would reuse those across tasks. If I have a procedure for opening the fridge, that's a good thing to have because I want to be able to reuse that subroutine across different things I might be doing in the kitchen. And we can build neural network architectures that are also endowed with this bias. Here's another example that I'm quite obsessed with right now, actually, and I'm working on with people in my group at DeepMind, which is about relational structure. So here's another version of reuse. The world is full of objects. If I learn about an object in one setting, it might be useful for me to preserve that knowledge in a form that I can apply when I see an object of the same kind in some other context. The same applies to features. Like if I know that it's important to be able to say that a particular block in these displays is clear, there's nothing on top of it, I might want to be able to use the same kind of representation to conclude that those other blocks are also clear. Relational representations are similar. So if I learn that what it means for block C to be on top of block B over there, I probably want to be able to use that same representation to evaluate whether B is on top of C over on the other side or on the far side. These are, again, instances of reuse or symmetries in the data. And we can build neural network architectures that are biased toward the assumption that these kinds of symmetries are going to exist in the data. And because this is an inductive bias that we're building into the system, we can learn faster. So we've spelled out how this can be done in deep neural networks and DeepRL in a paper out of my group recently. So if you're interested in the details, I'd refer you to this review paper. Just one quick example, you can build a deep neural network that's doing reinforcement learning and put in the middle of it a neural network that has an architectural bias that has this kind of relational flavor. And just to give you the intuition, the thing takes an image and chops it up into objects or local patches, and then throws a representation of each of those entities into a slot, and then it uses the same function, which is implemented as a neural network, to compute relations between pairs of entities. And it's important that I said it uses the same function. So if I see two blocks over here, I can compute their relations. If I see two blocks over here, I use the same knowledge to compute their relationship. And because I'm not allowing the system to come up with two crazy different ways of comparing blocks, whether I see them over there or over there, I'm very sharply constraining the hypothesis space that this network is exploring as it tries to solve RL tasks. That's inductive bias, and it cuts down on sample. It cuts down on the needed sample. It increases sample efficiency. And colleagues in my group who worked on this at DeepMind were able to show that through experiments, both with deceptively simple planning tasks and very rich, visually rich computer games like StarCraft. Okay, so for symmetry here, I should now have a story about slow learning versus fast learning, and it might not be clear where that's going to come from because the fast learning here is coming out of something that the engineers built into these architectures. But let's think about this in a neuroscience, through a neuroscience analogy. It seems reasonable to me that the brain, which has a very interesting non-uniform architecture, might actually implement some architectural biases that are useful for fast learning. I mean, look, we learn language so quickly, there's got to be some bias in the system. We learn to see so quickly, there's got to be some bias in the system. Where did those biases come from? The answer is obvious: evolution. So you can think of evolution here as playing the role of that slow learning process, that slow, very unbiased learning process that's giving rise to a bias, which here is an architectural bias, which supports fast learning. So here again, if you kind of pan back, you can see that slow learning leading to fast learning dynamic. And one thing that's been very fun to see is that even in the AI community, people are using evolution-like techniques now in order to build neural network architectures that have interesting biases. This is a paper from my group at DeepMind, but there are many fascinating examples of this sort of thing. So in the closing minutes of my presentation, I just want to point out what's probably obvious from everything I've said, which is that there really are very rich connections between all of the techniques and in fact, all of the points that I've made in an AI setting and corresponding ideas and pieces of knowledge on the neuroscience side. So obviously, episodic control, it's not a coincidence that we call it episodic control. It was really inspired originally by people thinking broadly about episodic memory in the psychology literature. And in fact, there are already papers out there in the neuroscience and psychology literature talking about how episodic control, in this sense, drawing on episodic memories of single experiences, can support rapid reinforcement learning. So in particular, I recommend this paper by Sam Grossman and Nathaniel Daw, which is on exactly that topic. When it comes to meta-learning, it's extremely easy to make the case for neural analogs, and in fact, that's just what we did in a paper we published in Nature Neuroscience earlier this year, where we used meta-reinforcement learning in recurrent networks very directly to address a diverse set of phenomena relating to both prefrontal cortex and dopamine. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into an explanation of those, but I refer you to this paper if you want to see the way that plays out. Okay, but in any case, in closing, so I've tried to accomplish a few things. One is, if nothing else, I hope there are some people here who haven't heard of deep reinforcement learning before or didn't know much about it, and may be inspired to learn more about it, both because it's a fascinating research topic in itself, and because, at least I've made the argument, it has pretty profound and so far very little explored neuroscientific implications. But I've also, taken on board this apparent limitation of deep reinforcement learning, which is that, at least in most of our applications of it so far, it's highly sample inefficient, which is in strong contrast to human and animal learning. And then I've talked about ways in which we can go back and revisit the limitations of deep reinforcement learning, especially incremental parameter adjustment and inductive bias, and work around those in ways that give us fast reinforcement learning. And then in each of these cases, to show you why fast learning depends on some slower, less biased form of learning, and to point out these interesting potential neural connections. So the one thing I want to close on, I know I'm out of time, this will just be brief, is to come back to this notion of slow versus fast and biased versus unbiased. Because the more I've kind of rehearsed these ideas for myself, the more it seems compelling to me to think about learning in both artificial and especially biological systems as kind of operating in a kind of like a layered form, or like I picture like the layers of an onion, where there are some highly low bias and very slow learning procedures operating, like evolution, which are training faster and more biased forms of learning, for example, through the introduction of architectural biases, which themselves are training faster and more biased forms of learning, for example, through meta-learning or through the design of episodic control architectures. And I think going forward, this may provide an interesting framework for thinking about the way that different learning mechanisms interact in biology. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.